The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church like desperate fingers clawing for sanctuary. October 23, 1977. The kind of Pacific Northwest storm that swallowed sound and made the world feel smaller, more intimate, more dangerous. Inside the modest sanctuary, 47 parishioners sat in wooden pews that had witnessed decades of prayers, confessions, and quiet desperation. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting dancing shadows across the walls adorned with simple crosses and faded biblical verses. At the pulpit stood Pastor William Thorsen, a man whose gentle demeanor and unwavering faith had anchored this small logging community of Millbrook, Oregon, for nearly 2 decades. Thorsen was 52 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of steady presence that made people feel heard when they spoke and comforted when they wept. His wife, Margaret, sat in the front pew with their teenage daughter, Rebecca, both watching as he delivered what would become known as his final sermon. Brothers and sisters, Thorsen's voice carried across the sanctuary with practiced authority. We gather tonight not just to worship, but to remember that even in our darkest hours, we are not abandoned. The congregation nodded, many clutching their coats tighter as thunder rolled overhead. This was an evening service, something Thorsen had introduced 6 months earlier to accommodate the mill workers who couldn't attend Sunday mornings. It had become popular, drawing not just regular parishioners but occasional visitors from neighboring towns. Among those present that night was Detective Frank Kowalski of the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, though he wouldn't become central to this story until much later. Kowalski sat near the back, his weathered hands folded in his lap, seeking the same solace that had drawn him to these evening services for the past month. His own demons, born from 20 years of police work, seemed quieter within these walls. Also in attendance was Evelyn Martinez, the church secretary who would later tell investigators that Pastor Thorsen had seen different that evening. Not troubled exactly, but contemplative in a way that suggested he was wrestling with something significant. She noticed how his eyes lingered on certain faces in the congregation, as if memorizing them. The sermon that night focused on the story of Job, the righteous man tested by unimaginable loss. Thorsen spoke with unusual intensity about faith persevering through trials that made no earthly sense, about trusting in divine purpose, even when that purpose remained hidden. Sometimes, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean forward, God calls us to walk through valleys we never imagined existed. Sometimes he asks us to sacrifice not just our comfort, but our understanding itself. Margaret Thorsen would later replay these words obsessively, searching for hidden meaning, for some clue about what was coming. Rebecca, then 17 and more interested in her boyfriend than biblical metaphors, barely registered her father's words. This would haunt her for decades. The service concluded at 8:47 p.m. according to the church clock, though several witnesses noted the time differently. Thorsen offered his usual closing blessing, his hands raised over the congregation as rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows. May the Lord bless you and keep you, he intoned, his voice carrying a weight that seemed heavier than usual. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. The congregation began to disperse, pulling on raincoats and opening umbrellas. The ritual was familiar, comforting. Handshakes and brief conversations near the door. Plans made for the following Sunday, concerns shared about elderly members who hadn't attended due to the weather. Pastor Thorsen remained near the altar, speaking quietly with Harold Grimsby, a widower who had been struggling since his wife's death 3 months earlier. Evelyn Martinez busied herself collecting hymnals and turning off lights in the side rooms. Margaret and Rebecca waited by the door, Margaret holding an umbrella and chatting with other wives about her upcoming church potluck. It was Harold who would provide the last confirmed sighting of Pastor William Thorsen alive. He seemed peaceful, Harold would later tell investigators, his voice shaking with the weight of survivor's guilt. Said something about how storms always pass, but the morning light reveals what was always true. Didn't think much of it at the time, just figured he was being his usual thoughtful self. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Harold remembered shaking the pastor's hand, remembered the firm grip and direct eye contact that had always made him feel valued. He remembered Thorsen walking him toward the door, But Harold had hurried out into the storm, eager to get home before the roads became impassable. By 9:15 p.m. the church was empty except for the Thorsen family. Margaret had finished her conversations and was growing impatient. Rebecca was openly annoyed, wanting to meet friends at the local diner before it closed. Both women stood by the front door, watching as Pastor Thorsen moved through the sanctuary with his usual post-service routine. He extinguished the altar candles, secured the offering box, and straightened the communion tablecloth. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested a man preparing to vanish from the face of the earth. William, Margaret called out, her voice echoing in the now empty space. "We need to go. This storm is getting worse." "Just a moment, dear," he replied, his voice carrying that same contemplative tone Evelyn had noticed. "I want to check something in my office." That was the last time Margaret Thorsen heard her husband's voice. Pastor Thorsen's office was located at the rear of the church, accessible through a narrow hallway lined with bulletin boards and children's artwork. It was a small, cluttered space filled with theological books, sermon notes, and the accumulated paperwork of parish life. A single window looked out onto the church parking lot and the dense Oregon forest beyond. Margaret and Rebecca waited. 5 minutes stretched to 10, then 15. The storm continued its assault, and both women were growing anxious about the drive home on increasingly dangerous roads. "Mom, can't you just go get him?" Rebecca asked, her teenage impatience finally overriding her usual deference to church protocol. Margaret hesitated. Her husband valued his privacy, especially when he was preparing sermons or counseling materials. Interrupting him in his office was something she rarely did. But the weather was becoming genuinely concerning. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The office door was closed, unusual for this time of evening when William typically left it open while tidying up. "William?" She knocked gently. No response. "William, we really need to leave." Silence. Silence. Margaret tried the handle. Locked. This sent the first real chill of alarm through her system. William never locked his office door during evening services. Church policy, he always said. People should feel they could seek counsel at any time. She knocked harder. "William, answer me." "Mine." Rebecca appeared at her shoulder, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern. "Maybe he went out the back door?" The office had a rear exit that led directly to the parking lot, though it was rarely used. Margaret and Rebecca hurried outside, rain immediately soaking through their coats. The parking lot held only their car and 2 others belonging to church members who had offered to help with cleanup. Pastor Thorsen's 1974 Ford pickup truck sat exactly where he had parked it before the service. The keys still in the ignition, driver's side door unlocked. His wallet lay on the passenger seat, containing $43 and his driver's license. His winter coat hung on a hook in the church entryway. The man had simply evaporated. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office received Margaret's frantic call at 10:23 p.m. Deputy Jim Callahan responded first, arriving at St. Matthew's through sheets of rain that had transformed the rural roads into treacherous waterways. Callahan was young, relatively new to police work, and completely unprepared for what he encountered. A missing person case where the person had apparently disappeared from a locked room, leaving behind all personal effects, up in the middle of a worship service attended by nearly 50 people. The initial investigation was thorough but yielded nothing logical. Deputies forced open the office door to find everything in perfect order, but no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no indication that anyone had left through the rear exit. The door showed no evidence of being opened that evening. Dust patterns on the floor were undisturbed near the threshold. Pastor Thorsen's desk held his sermon notes for the following Sunday, half completed and written in his careful handwriting. His appointment calendar showed meetings scheduled for the entire following week. The cup of coffee sat on his desk, still warm to the touch. Detective Frank Kowalski arrived at 11:47 p.m., his presence at the evening service now transformed from personal solace seeking to professional obligation. He had been among the last to see William Thorsen alive, had shaken his hand after the service, had noticed nothing unusual beyond the pastor's contemplative mood. Kowalski was a methodical investigator, the kind of cop who believed that every mystery had a logical solution if you looked hard enough and long enough. He had solved cases that others had written off as hopeless. But standing in that tidy office, looking at the warm coffee and unfinished sermon, he felt the first stirrings of something that would plague him for the rest of his career. The certainty that some questions simply had no answers. And the search began immediately, despite the storm. Volunteers from the congregation joined sheriff's deputies in combing the surrounding forest. As flashlight beams cut through the darkness, voices called out William's name. Search dogs arrived from neighboring counties. They found nothing. The Oregon woods that surrounded Millbrook were dense, ancient, and unforgiving. Towering Douglas firs and redwoods created a canopy so thick that daylight barely penetrated even in good weather. During the storm, the forest became a maze of shadow and sound, where searchers could pass within yards of each other without making contact. But experienced search teams knew these woods. They knew where a disoriented person might wander, where someone seeking shelter might take refuge, where a body might fall and remain hidden. They checked every logical location, then expanded their search to include the illogical ones. William Thorsen had simply ceased to exist. The investigation that followed consumed Detective Kowalski's life for the next 3 years. He interviewed every member of the congregation, tracked down visitors who had attended that final service, followed up on every lead and theory that emerged from the community. Margaret Thorsen became his most frequent contact and his greatest source of frustration. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of her husband's habits, concerns, and relationships, yet could offer no insight into his disappearance. William had been happy, she insisted. Their marriage was solid, their financial situation stable, their daughter healthy and succeeding in school. He wouldn't leave us, she told Kowalski during one of their many interviews. I know people always say that, but William genuinely wouldn't. Not without explanation, not without saying goodbye. He was incapable of causing that kind of pain. Rebecca provided similar testimony, though colored by teenage self-absorption that made her observations less reliable. She remembered her father being weird that night, but couldn't articulate what she meant by weird, but different somehow. Like he was thinking about something important. The congregation members painted a consistent picture of William Thorsen as a beloved spiritual leader, without enemies or obvious sources of conflict. His finances were modest but managed responsibly. His health was excellent. His relationships with church leadership were harmonious. Yet someone had vanished from a locked room, leaving behind a warm cup of coffee and a half-written sermon. Theories proliferated within the community and among investigators. Some suggested William had suffered a mental breakdown and wandered into the forest, perhaps succumbing to the elements before searchers could locate his body. Others proposed more sinister explanations: kidnapping, murder, elaborate schemes to fake his own death. The locked office became the central puzzle. How does a man exit a room that remains locked from the inside, with no evidence of the rear door being used? Deputies tested every possible explanation. Could someone have locked the door from outside? The mechanism made this impossible. Could William have left through the window? It remained latched, with no disturbance to the dust and cobwebs on the sill. Kowalski spent sleepless nights in that office, sitting in William's chair, trying to understand what had happened. He measured distances, tested sight lines, examined every inch of flooring and walls for hidden passages or overlooked clues. The church was a simple structure, built in 1949 with no architectural mysteries or secret rooms. The case attracted attention beyond Douglas County. The Portland newspapers ran stories about the vanishing pastor. Television news crews arrived to film segments about the mysterious disappearance. The congregation found themselves thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, their grief and confusion transformed into public entertainment. Gradually, as months passed without new leads or developments, media attention faded, and the case files grew thicker but no more enlightening. Detective Kowalski was reassigned to other investigations, though he never stopped thinking about William Thorsen. The warm coffee cup, the unfinished sermon, and the locked door. Margaret and Rebecca Thorsen began the painful process of rebuilding their lives around an absence that defied understanding. Margaret took a job at the local library, needing both income and distraction. Rebecca threw herself into her senior year of high school, eventually accepting a scholarship to Oregon State University. The church struggled without its spiritual leader. A series of interim pastors failed to capture the warmth and stability that William had provided. Attendance dwindled, and by 1980, St. Matthew's Lutheran Church closed its doors permanently. The building stood empty for several years, gradually falling into disrepair. The windows were boarded up, the parking lot became overgrown with blackberry vines, and the forest began to reclaim the structure. Teenagers occasionally broke in for parties or dares, but most residents avoided the place entirely. It had become a monument to unanswered questions. Detective Kowalski retired in 1987, his final case file still containing William Thorsen's folder, now several inches thick with interviews, search reports, and investigative dead ends. He had never stopped believing that the solution existed somewhere within those pages, waiting for the right connection or insight. Margaret Thorsen remarried in 1983 to a kind librarian named Robert Hayes. She kept William's name professionally but found peace in her new relationship. Rebecca graduated from college, became a social worker, and moved to California. Both women learned to live with the permanent ache of unresolved loss. The years passed. 1977 became 1987, then 1997. The Thorsen case faded into local legend, the kind of story told around campfires or during late-night conversations about unexplained mysteries. New residents of Millbrook learned about the vanishing pastor as part of the town's folklore. But some stories refused to die. In the summer of 2002, exactly 25 years after William Thorsen's disappearance, a local environmental group organized a forest cleanup project in the hills above Millbrook. Volunteers spread through the woods collecting trash, removing invasive plant species, and cataloging the health of old-growth trees. Among the volunteers was Tommy Chen, a recent forestry graduate from the University of Oregon. Chen was assigned to work in a remote section of forest roughly 2 miles northeast of where St. Matthew's Church had once stood. The area was dense with massive redwoods and Douglas firs, some estimated to be over 200 years old. Chen was examining the root system of a particularly impressive redwood when his shovel struck something hard buried in the accumulated forest debris. Assuming it was a rock, he dug more aggressively, trying to clear the obstruction. What he uncovered changed everything. A black leather Bible, wrapped in what appeared to be a clear plastic bag, buried approximately 18 inches below the surface. The plastic had protected the book from moisture and decay, leaving it in remarkably good condition despite its quarter-century underground internment. Chen opened the Bible carefully and immediately noticed the inscription on the inside front cover, written in faded blue ink, "To William, with love and prayers for your ministry. Christmas 1958. Margaret." He had found Pastor William Thorsen's Bible. The discovery sent shockwaves through what remained of Millbrook's original community. Detective Frank Kowalski, now retired but still living in the area, received a phone call that brought him back to the case he had never truly abandoned. The current Douglas County Sheriff, Janet Richardson, reopened the investigation immediately. The Bible was sent to the state crime lab for analysis, while search teams returned to the forest with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. The Bible yielded few clues about how it had ended up buried beneath the redwood. Forensic analysis found no fingerprints other than those belonging to William and Margaret Thorsen. The plastic bag showed no manufacturer's marks or distinctive characteristics. The burial site revealed no other artifacts or evidence of disturbance. But the discovery proved one crucial fact. William Thorsen had not simply wandered into the woods and died of exposure. Someone had deliberately buried his Bible in a remote location, wrapping it carefully for preservation and marking the spot in a way that suggested significance. The question that haunted investigators was simple: who had buried the Bible, and why? Margaret Thorsen, now Margaret Hayes, was 73 years old when Sheriff Richardson contacted her about the discovery. The decades had softened her grief into a manageable ache, and she had built a satisfying life around her second marriage and her work with literacy programs. Seeing William's Bible again, holding it in her hands for the first time since 1977, reopened wounds she thought had healed. "I gave him this for Christmas in 1958, she told Sheriff Richardson, her voice barely steady. "It was our first Christmas as a married couple. I had it specially engraved." She ran her fingers over the familiar cover, remembering her young husband's face when he unwrapped it. William had used this Bible for every sermon, every counseling session, every personal devotion for nearly 20 years. It had been as much a part of his daily life as his wedding ring or his reading glasses. Rebecca, now Rebecca Thorsen Martinez, and living in Sacramento with her own family, flew to Oregon immediately upon hearing the news. At 42, she possessed her father's gentle demeanor combined with her mother's practical strength. The discovery of the Bible affected her more deeply than she had anticipated. "I thought I had made peace with never knowing what happened to Dad," she told investigators. "But seeing his Bible, knowing someone buried it out there, it brings back all the questions." Sheriff Richardson assembled a task force that included retired Detective Kowalski as a consultant. Modern investigative techniques that had been unavailable in 1977 were applied to the original evidence. Cold case specialists reviewed every interview, every theory, every lead that had been pursued during the initial investigation. The forest around the burial site was subjected to the most thorough search in the case's history. Ground-penetrating radar identified several anomalies in the soil, leading to careful excavation of multiple locations. None yielded human remains or additional evidence. The Redwood itself became an object of intense scrutiny. The forestry experts estimated the tree's age at approximately 300 years, making it a sapling when Lewis and Clark first explored the Oregon coast. It had witnessed the displacement of indigenous peoples, the arrival of European settlers, the rise and fall of the logging industry, and now the mysterious burial of a pastor's Bible. Examination of the root system revealed something unexpected. The Bible had not been buried randomly. It was located at the exact point where 4 major roots converged, creating a natural hollow in the forest floor. Someone had chosen this location deliberately, possibly as a marker or memorial. But who? And why wait 25 years to be discovered? The investigation team interviewed everyone still alive who had been connected to the original case. Many had died in the intervening years, taking their memories and potential insights to their graves. Others had moved away from Oregon, building new lives far from the mystery that had once consumed their small community. Harold Grimsby, the widower who had provided the last confirmed sighting of William Thorsen, was now 89 years old and residing in a Portland nursing home. His memories of that October evening were fragmentary but consistent with his original statement. "Pastor was thoughtful that night," Harold repeated, his voice thin but certain. Talked about storms passing and morning light revealing truth. It seemed like he was preparing for something, but I figured he meant his sermon for the following week. Evelyn Martinez, the former church secretary, had died in 1995, but her daughter provided investigators with boxes of church records that her mother had preserved. Among these documents was something that had been overlooked in the original investigation, a handwritten note found in William's desk after his disappearance. The note, written in William's careful script, contained a list of Bible verses related to sacrifice, faith, and divine mystery. At the bottom of the page was a single line: "Some truths can only be revealed through surrender." Sheriff Richardson showed the note to Margaret Hayes, who studied it carefully before shaking her head. "I don't recognize this. It's William's handwriting, but I can't imagine what he meant by it." The Bible verses on the list became the focus of intensive analysis. Theological scholars were consulted to determine if the selected passages revealed any pattern or message. The verses dealt with themes of testing faith under trial and the necessity of trusting divine purpose, even when it remained hidden from human understanding. One verse appeared twice on the list, Job 13:15, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." The investigation had uncovered more questions than answers, but it had accomplished something significant. It had transformed William Thorsen from a missing person into the victim of a deliberate act. The careful burial of his Bible proved that his disappearance was not accidental, not the result of a medical emergency or moment of confusion. Someone had taken Pastor William Thorsen, and someone had buried his most precious possession in a location chosen for its symbolic meaning. Detective Kowalski, now 78 years old but still sharp, spent his days reviewing the expanded case file. He had been granted access to all evidence and interview transcripts, and he approached the mystery with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized his original investigation. Sitting in his small apartment overlooking the Umpqua River, surrounded by boxes of documents and crime scene photographs, Kowalski tried to construct a timeline that made sense. October 23, 1977, William Thorsen vanishes from his locked office. Sometime between 1977 and 2002, someone buries his Bible beneath an ancient redwood, carefully preserved and positioned at the convergence of major routes. The gap of 25 years troubled him most. Why wait so long? Why choose that specific location? Why preserve the Bible so carefully if the intent was simply to hide evidence? Kowalski had investigated hundreds of cases during his career, had seen every variety of human cruelty and deception. But the Thorsen case possessed elements that defied conventional criminal logic. The care taken to preserve the Bible suggested reverence rather than disposal. The choice of burial location implied meaning rather than mere concealment. On a warm September afternoon, exactly 1 year after the Bible's discovery, Kowalski drove to the forest site alone. At his age, the hike to the Redwood required considerable effort, but he needed to see the location for himself, to understand what someone might have been thinking when they chose this spot. Standing beside the massive tree, looking down at the disturbed earth where the Bible had been buried, Kowalski felt the same frustrated helplessness that had plagued him for 26 years. The forest was silent, except for wind in the canopy and distant bird calls. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with the breeze. The beauty of the location was undeniable. If someone had wanted to create a memorial to William Thorsen, they could hardly have chosen a more appropriate setting. The ancient tree represented endurance, faith, the kind of steadfast presence that William had provided to his congregation. But memorials were typically created by people who mourned the deceased. Someone who had cared about William Thorsen had buried his Bible in this sacred grove. Someone who wanted his memory preserved but hidden, honored but secret. The contradiction consumed Kowalski's thoughts during the long hike back to his car. Love and secrecy, reverence and concealment, memorial and mystery. But as autumn arrived in Oregon, bringing with it the anniversary of William's disappearance, the investigation faced a crucial decision point. Sheriff Richardson had authorized significant resources for the cold case review, but without new leads or evidence, the case would soon return to inactive status. The media attention generated by the Bible's discovery had prompted several new tips and theories, but none had proven credible. Psychics offered their services, conspiracy theorists proposed elaborate scenarios, and well-meaning citizens reported suspicious memories from decades past. All were investigated and dismissed. Margaret Hayes found herself reliving the trauma of 1977, but with the added weight of 25 years of accumulated grief. The discovery of William's Bible had answered one question while creating dozens of others. She knew now that her husband had not chosen to abandon his family, but she still had no idea what had happened to him or why. Rebecca Thorsen Martinez struggled with similar emotions, thus complicated by her role as a mother, trying to explain to her own children why their grandfather remained such a source of pain and mystery. How do you tell a child that sometimes people simply disappear, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered? The investigation continued through the winter of 2003, but momentum gradually slowed as leads were exhausted and theories disproven. Detective Kowalski maintained his personal commitment to the case, but he was realistic about the challenges they faced. 26 years had passed since William's disappearance. Evidence had degraded, witnesses had died, memories had faded. Yet something about the buried Bible continued to trouble him. And the location, the careful preservation, the timing of its discovery after exactly 25 years. These elements suggested a plan, a purpose that remained hidden from investigators. As spring arrived in the Oregon mountains, bringing new growth to the forest where William's Bible had been buried, Kowalski made a decision that would define the final chapter of his involvement in the case. He would return to the beginning, reviewing every detail of that October evening in 1977, searching for the clue that had eluded him for more than 2 decades. The truth was there, he believed, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with enough patience and insight to finally see it. Detective Frank Kowalski had always believed that the truth lived in the details, lurking in the spaces between official statements and careful testimonies. As spring turned to summer in 2003, he embarked on what he privately considered his final investigation, a methodical re-examination of every piece of evidence from that October night 26 years earlier. His apartment became a shrine to obsession. Walls covered with timeline charts, photographs from 1977 pinned beside recent images of the Bible burial site, this interview transcripts arranged in chronological order. His dining table disappeared beneath boxes of evidence, forcing him to eat his meals standing at the kitchen counter while studying crime scene reports. At 79 years old, Kowalski possessed the kind of focused intensity that comes from knowing time is limited. His health was declining, his memory occasionally unreliable, but his investigative instincts remained sharp. This case had defined his career, had haunted his retirement, and now demanded resolution before age claimed his ability to pursue it. He began with the church building itself, obtaining blueprints from the county assessor's office and comparing them to his memories of the crime scene. St. Matthew's had been demolished in 1998, but the architectural plans revealed details that had been overlooked during the original investigation. The church basement, rarely used except for storage, contained a network of utility tunnels that connected to the main building's heating system. These tunnels had been examined in 1977, but only superficially. They were narrow, dusty, and appeared to lead nowhere significant. Kowalski spent hours studying the blueprints, tracing the path of these tunnels with a magnifying glass. Most connected various mechanical systems, but one branch extended beyond the building's foundation, ending at what appeared to be an external utility access point. This discovery sent him to the Douglas County Public Works Department, where decades-old utility records revealed something crucial. The external access point had been sealed in 1973 during a renovation project, 4 years before William Thorsen's disappearance. But the sealing had been done with a removable cover, designed to allow future maintenance access. The implications were staggering. Someone familiar with the church's infrastructure could potentially have accessed the building through the utility tunnel. Even after the external entrance had been officially sealed, Sheriff Richardson authorized an excavation of the former church site, now overgrown with brambles and young trees. Using ground-penetrating radar and the original blueprints as guides, the team located the sealed utility access point approximately 30 yards behind where the altar had once stood. The metal cover was corroded but intact, secured with bolts that showed signs of having been removed and replaced multiple times over the years. When investigators carefully lifted the cover, they found a narrow concrete tunnel, barely large enough for an adult to crawl through, leading directly toward the church's foundation. The tunnel was dry, filled with decades of accumulated debris, but forensic examination revealed something remarkable. Fabric fibers caught on the rough concrete walls, fibers that preliminary analysis suggested could date to the late 1970s. More disturbing was the discovery of scratch marks in the concrete, gouges that appeared to have been made by fingernails or metal objects being dragged through the confined space. The pattern suggested desperate movement, someone or something being pulled through the tunnel against significant resistance. Kowalski stood at the tunnel entrance, his aging body protesting against the bent posture required to examine the confined space. The tunnel was claustrophobic, nightmarish, the kind of route that would terrorize anyone forced to traverse it. Yet someone had used this passage, possibly on the night of October 23, 1977. The discovery transformed the entire understanding of William Thorsen's disappearance. The locked office door was no longer an impossible puzzle. Someone could have entered the church through the utility tunnel, accessed the basement, and moved through the building's interior passages to reach the pastor's office. They could have confronted William, overpowered him, and forced him back through the same route. But this theory raised new questions. Those who possessed knowledge of the tunnel system, these who had the physical capability to force a healthy 52-year-old man through such a confined space. And why go to such elaborate lengths when simpler methods of kidnapping existed? Sheriff Richardson expanded the investigation team to include specialists in underground crime scenes and forensic architecture. The fabric fibers were sent to an FBI laboratory for detailed analysis, while the scratch marks in the concrete were photographed and measured with precision instruments. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, now 71 and living in a Portland retirement community, contacted investigators after seeing news coverage of the tunnel discovery. Morrison had been the church janitor from 1975 to 1978, responsible for maintaining the building's mechanical systems. "I knew about that tunnel," she told Sheriff Richardson during a phone interview. "Had to crawl through there a couple times when the main heating system acted up. Wasn't supposed to tell anyone about it, though. Church board was worried about liability if kids found out and tried to explore." Morrison provided crucial details about the tunnel's accessibility. The external cover could be removed with standard tools, though it required considerable effort. The passage connected to a utility room in the church basement, accessible through an unmarked door that most parishioners assumed led to a storage closet. More importantly, Morrison revealed that at least 3 people had known about the tunnel's existence: herself, Harold Grimsby, who had helped with occasional maintenance work, and Pastor Thorsen himself, who had asked detailed questions about the building's infrastructure during his first year at St. Matthew's. Harold Grimsby, the widower who had provided the last confirmed sighting of William Thorsen alive. The man who had spoken with the pastor after the service, who had mentioned William's strange comment about storms passing and morning light revealing truth. Kowalski felt the familiar electricity of a case breaking open. At 89, Harold was the oldest surviving witness from that October evening. A man whose grief over his wife's death had made him a frequent presence at church events and maintenance activities. The nursing home interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in July 2003. Kowalski arrived early, spending time in the parking lot reviewing his notes and preparing questions that might elicit information without alerting Harold to the tunnel discovery. And Harold Grimsby occupied a small room overlooking the facility's garden, his body frail but his mind still sharp. He greeted Kowalski with genuine warmth, remembering the detective from their previous interviews, despite the passage of years. "Still thinking about Pastor William, are you?" Harold asked, settling into his wheelchair with the careful movements of advanced age. "Can't say I blame you. That night haunts me too." Kowalski began with general questions about Harold's relationship with the church, his maintenance work, his knowledge of the building's systems. Harold answered readily, describing repairs he had assisted with, problems he had helped resolve, and the satisfaction he had found in maintaining God's house during his retirement years. Then Kowalski mentioned the basement utility systems, the heating infrastructure, the various access points that allowed maintenance work. Harold's expression changed subtly, a flicker of wariness crossing his weathered features. "Why are you asking about that now? I thought you were interested in what happened to Pastor William." "I am," Kowalski replied carefully. "We are trying to understand how someone might have moved through the church that night without being seen." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his blanket, and his eyes avoided direct contact with Kowalski's gaze. "Harold," Kowalski said gently, "we found the tunnel." The old man's composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure. Tears began flowing down his cheeks, and his voice became barely audible. "I never meant for it to happen that way," he whispered. "God help me, I never meant for him to die." The confession that followed unraveled 26 years of mystery while revealing a tragedy more complex and heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Harold's wife, Dorothy, had been diagnosed with terminal cancer in early 1977. The medical bills had consumed their life savings, forcing Harold to mortgage their home and exhaust their retirement funds. Dorothy's suffering had been prolonged and agonizing, and Harold had watched helplessly as the woman he loved deteriorated into a shadow of herself. During this period, Harold had confided his financial desperation to Pastor Thorsen, seeking both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. William had been compassionate but limited in what the church could provide. The congregation's resources were modest, and while they offered meals and emotional support, they couldn't address Harold's mounting debt. In desperation, Harold had approached William with a proposition that shame had prevented him from revealing to investigators in 1977. He knew that the church maintained an emergency fund, accumulated over years through special offerings and bequests. Harold asked to borrow against this fund, offering to repay the money after Dorothy's death when he could sell their home. Pastor Thorsen had refused, explaining gently but firmly that the emergency fund was designated for specific purposes and couldn't be used for personal loans, and even to beloved congregation members facing genuine crises. Harold's grief and desperation had transformed into resentment, then anger, then something darker. He began to see William's refusal as a betrayal of Christian charity, a failure to live up to the compassion he preached from the pulpit. Dorothy had died on September 15, 1977, leaving Harold alone with crushing debt and consuming rage. The funeral service, conducted by Pastor Thorsen with characteristic warmth and dignity, had felt like hypocrisy to Harold. How could this man speak of God's love while refusing to help when help was desperately needed? The plan had formed gradually, fed by sleepless nights and alcohol-fueled self-pity. But Harold knew about the utility tunnel from his maintenance work. He knew the church's schedule, the pastor's habits, the routines that governed evening services. On October 23rd, Harold had attended the service as usual, sitting in his regular pew, participating in prayers and hymns while harboring intentions that would have horrified his former self. After speaking with Pastor Thorsen near the altar, he had left through the front door with other parishioners, but had immediately circled back to the sealed utility access point. The external cover had been difficult to remove in the rain, requiring nearly 20 minutes of effort with tools he had brought in a canvas bag. Crawling through the narrow tunnel had been claustrophobic and terrifying, but rage had overcome his fear. He had waited in the basement utility room until he heard Margaret and Rebecca calling for William from the hallway above. Then he had climbed the stairs, approached the pastor's office, and knocked on the door. William had opened the door immediately, surprised but not alarmed to see Harold. "Did you forget something?" Harold had pushed his way into the office, revealing the hunting knife he had brought from home. "We need to talk about that money, Pastor." What followed was not the confrontation Harold had envisioned. William had remained calm, had spoken quietly about understanding Harold's pain while refusing to change his position about the church funds. But his gentleness in the face of threatened violence had only intensified Harold's rage. "He kept talking about forgiveness," Harold told Kowalski, his voice breaking with remembered anguish. "Said he forgave me, said God would provide another way, said my grief was making me do things I'd regret. I couldn't stand hearing it, couldn't stand his pity." The attack had been sudden and vicious. Harold had struck William with the knife handle, knocking him unconscious, then had panicked at what he had done. Pastor Thorsen was bleeding from a head wound but still breathing. Harold's plan, such as it was, had not included actual violence. And in his terror and confusion, Harold had made a decision that would haunt him forever. He had dragged the unconscious pastor through the church, down into the basement, and into the utility tunnel. His intention was to hide the body somewhere in the forest until he could decide what to do. But William Thorsen had regained consciousness while being pulled through the narrow passage. "He woke up in that tunnel," Harold whispered, the memory clearly tormenting him. "Started fighting, trying to get away. I panicked, started hitting him to make him stop struggling. The space was so tight, couldn't hardly move, and he was fighting so hard." Pastor Thorsen had died in that concrete tomb, probably from a combination of head trauma and suffocation. Harold had continued pulling the body through the tunnel, emerging into the forest behind the church with a corpse instead of an unconscious hostage. The burial had taken place in a remote section of woods, a hastily dug grave that Harold had covered with rocks and forest debris. He had chosen the location randomly, driven by panic rather than planning. Returning through the tunnel, Harold had cleaned up the office as best he could, removing obvious signs of struggle and wiping down surfaces. He had locked the door from inside using the simple turn lock mechanism, then had exited through the utility tunnel, replacing the external cover and returning home. The investigation that followed had been torture for Harold. But every interview, every search, every expression of grief from Margaret and Rebecca had deepened his guilt and shame. He had attended William's memorial service, had comforted the family, had participated in search efforts, all while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. But the confession contained one more revelation that explained the discovery of the buried Bible 25 years later. In 1985, development plans for the forest area had threatened Harold's secret burial site. Panicked that construction equipment might uncover Pastor Thorsen's remains, Harold had returned to the grave under cover of darkness. The body was largely skeletal by then, scattered by animals and natural decomposition. Harold had gathered what bones he could find and reburied them in a deeper, more remote location. Among the scattered belongings, he had found William's Bible, somehow preserved in the plastic bag that had protected William's personal items. Unable to destroy the holy book but unwilling to keep it, Harold had chosen to bury it separately, in a location that seemed appropriate for such a sacred object. The ancient Redwood had felt like a natural cathedral, a place where William's memory could rest in peace. For 18 years Harold had lived with his terrible secret, watching as William's family struggled with unanswered questions, as the community mourned their beloved pastor. Investigators pursued leads that led nowhere. The confession broke him completely. By the time Sheriff Richardson arrived at the nursing home, Harold was in medical distress, his body finally succumbing to the weight of decades-long guilt and shame. He died 3 days later, never regaining consciousness, taking with him the exact location of Pastor William Thorsen's final resting place. The revelation of Harold's confession sent shockwaves through what remained of Millbrook's original community. Margaret Hayes, now 74, struggled to process the knowledge that her husband had been murdered by someone she had considered a friend, that someone she had comforted during his own time of grief. Harold helped search for William, she told investigators, her voice hollow with disbelief. He brought food to our house, sat with Rebecca when she cried, told us not to give up hope. How could he do that, knowing what he had done? Rebecca Thorsen Martinez experienced a different kind of trauma. Learning the truth about her father's death provided closure she had craved for decades. But it also revealed the depth of human deception and evil that she had been protected from as a teenager. The search for Pastor Thorsen's remains became the investigation's final phase. Harold's confession had provided general information about the burial location, but the Oregon wilderness was vast, and 26 years had passed since the original grave. Forensic teams used Harold's description to identify several possible sites, employing ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and systematic excavation. The search continued through the autumn of 2003, but no human remains were discovered. Detective Kowalski, his health declining rapidly, made one final visit to the forest where William's Bible had been buried. Standing beside the ancient Redwood, he reflected on a case that had consumed most of his professional life and all of his retirement. The mystery was solved, the perpetrator identified, justice served in the only way still possible. Yet something felt incomplete. Pastor William Thorsen's body remained lost in the wilderness, his family still denied the dignity of proper burial and final goodbye. On a December morning when frost covered the forest floor and his breath formed clouds in the cold air, Kowalski experienced what he would later describe as a moment of perfect clarity. Harold Grimsby had been a practical man, even in his desperation. He wouldn't have buried William's body in a location that was difficult to access or remember. The Bible burial site provided a clue. Harold had chosen the Redwood because it was distinctive, memorable, a landmark that wouldn't change over time. The original burial would have followed similar logic. Kowalski studied topographical maps of the area, looking for features that Harold would have recognized and remembered. A distinctive rock formation, a bend in a creek, a cluster of unusual trees, something that would have been visible even at night, even to someone operating in panic and fear. The breakthrough came from examining Harold's own property records. His home in 1977 had been located on the eastern edge of Millbrook, backing up to Forest Service land. Harold would have known the trails and landmarks in that specific area from years of casual hiking and hunting. Using this insight, search teams focused on a narrow corridor between Harold's former home and the Bible burial site. Within this area stood a distinctive granite outcropping known locally as Eagle Rock, visible from several miles away and marked on hiking maps dating back to the 1950s. On January 15, 2004, cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains approximately 200 yards southeast of Eagle Rock. Careful excavation revealed fragments of clothing, personal effects, and finally, skeletal remains that DNA analysis confirmed belonged to Pastor William Thorsen. He was found clutching a small wooden cross, carved from local pine, that had been given to him by his daughter Rebecca for Father's Day in 1975. The discovery provided the closure that Margaret Hayes and Rebecca Thorsen Martinez had sought for 27 years. William's remains were returned to his family for proper burial, and on a sunny Saturday in March 2004, the entire surviving congregation of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church gathered at Millbrook Cemetery for the funeral that should have taken place in 1977. Pastor David Chen from a neighboring parish conducted the service, reading from the same Bible that had been buried beneath the redwood and later recovered as evidence. Margaret chose to read from Job, the book her husband had preached from on his final evening. "I know that my Redeemer lives," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "and that in the end he will stand on the earth." Detective Frank Kowalski attended the funeral, though his failing health required him to use a wheelchair. At 80 years old, he had finally closed the case that had defined his career. He died peacefully in his sleep 6 weeks later, his final case file complete. The Thorsen murder case became a cautionary tale about the intersection of desperation, grief, and moral failure. Harold Grimsby had been a good man driven to evil by circumstances beyond his control and choices that compounded his tragedy. Pastor William Thorsen was remembered not just as a murder victim, but as a man whose final act had been to offer forgiveness to his killer, and even as his life was ending in a concrete tunnel beneath the church he had served with dedication and love. Margaret Hayes lived until 2011, spending her final years establishing a crisis assistance fund at area churches designed to help families facing the kind of financial desperation that had destroyed Harold Grimsby's moral compass. The fund was named in memory of her first husband, ensuring that William's legacy would include the practical compassion he had been unable to provide during his lifetime. Rebecca Thorsen Martinez continues her work as a social worker in California, specializing in grief counseling for families of murder victims. She often tells her clients that answers don't always bring peace, but they do allow healing to begin. The abandoned site of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church was purchased by the state of Oregon in 2005 and incorporated into a wilderness preserve. A small granite marker near the former altar reads, "In memory of Pastor William Thorsen, 1925 to 1977. His light shines in the darkness." The utility tunnel was filled with concrete, sealing forever the passage that had enabled both murder and mystery. The ancient redwood that sheltered William's Bible continues to grow, adding new rings each year, a living monument to faith, loss, and the terrible complexity of human nature. On quiet evenings when fog rolls through the Oregon mountains, visitors to the preserve sometimes report hearing what sounds like a distant hymn carried on the wind. The park rangers dismiss these reports as the natural acoustics of wind through trees, but those familiar with the story of Pastor William Thorsen aren't so certain. Some mysteries, once solved, give birth to new ones. Some stories, once ended, begin again in different forms. The truth had finally been revealed, just as William Thorsen had promised in his final sermon. The morning light had indeed illuminated what was always there, hidden beneath years of secrets and silence. But in the Oregon wilderness, where ancient trees stand witness to human tragedy and redemption, Some echoes never fully fade away.